Well, hello everybody. So I've been getting quite a few questions about rounding numbers recently because in my math lab, at least in the part of the class that we're in right now, you'll get often decimal answers and you'll be required to put your final answer in rounded to a certain number of decimal places, and that sometimes leads to confusion, and you might have done the math right but gotten the question wrong because you rounded it incorrectly. So let's just talk about rounding a little bit. Before I start talking about rounding, let me say something about numbers in general. Numbers have place values. Okay, so this number 465.26, the 4 is in the hundreds place, the 6 is in the tens place, the 5 is in the ones place. After the decimal point, we say that the 2 is in the tenths place and the 6 is in the hundredths place, and so on. So every digit in a number has a place value. If this was money, you might think of it as you could assemble this amount of money if you had $400 bills, six $10 bills, and five ones. Okay, it's another way to think about it. The numbers after the decimal are fractions. This 2 right here is 2/10. Okay, meaning if whatever you had, you divided it into 10 parts and you took 2 of those parts, that's what 2/10 is. The 6 being hundredths, you could say if you took a dollar and you divided it into 100 equal parts and you took 6 of those parts, that's what the 6 represents. 6 hundredths is 6 cents, in other words. So every digit has a name, a place value. Okay, now before I talk about rounding, I thought I might give you a way to think about it, because you could round numbers just as a matter of procedure without putting any thought to it at all. You just do it because you know how you're supposed to do it and you move on. You don't think about it, you don't wonder about it or anything. But it may help if you had a way to think about what you're doing. So say I've got this number 78 and I want to round it to the tens place. So the 8 is in the ones place and the 7 is in the tens place. So I want to round it to that digit. Here's what we're saying. It's like we're saying, you see the 8 right there? We don't care about the 8. We don't care about the ones. We just want to say, do you want to call 78 80 or do you want to call it 70? Since we don't care about the ones place. So rounding to the tens place means I don't care about the digits that come after it. So, all right, we're saying 78. Is it closer to 80 or is it closer to 70? Because those are the numbers that we're going to use. Okay, we don't care about 81, we don't care about 79, we don't care about 71. We care about 70 and 80. Well, okay, so obviously 78 is closer to 80 than it is to 70. So if I was going to round this to the tens place, then I would be calling it 80 because it's closer to 80 than it is to 70. All right. So that's roughly how it works. You can think of any rounding problem as kind of along those same lines. It might get more complicated if we have decimals, but it's the same idea. All right. Now, that will just kind of explain the broad thinking behind rounding. All right. It's like we don't care about the digits past a certain point, and we just want to call it, are we closer to this or that? All right. Okay, so let's look at some examples, and I'll talk about these a little more procedurally, okay, without thinking about philosophically. So say you want to round this number to 4 decimal places. Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm kind of looking at like this. Rounding it to 4 decimal places would be rounding it to that one. Okay, so like I don't care what comes after the 1. Now, the procedure is if the digit that comes after the place you want to round to is 5 or greater, then you bump this digit to the place you want to round to up by 1. If this digit after the place you want to round to is 4 or less, then you leave the digit at the place you're rounding alone. Now, here I want to round to 4 decimal places. The next digit is a 5. I said if that was 5 or greater, we would bump this up by 1. And so to round this to 4 decimal places would be 0.4672. Okay? All right. That's the procedure. That's how it's done. let's look at a few more examples. Let's say we have this one. We want to round to 2 decimal places. Okay, so I'm looking at this and I'm saying that's the 9 is in the second decimal place. Well, maybe here I could use that initial analogy that I had, down here where I said, oh, well, it's 78. Are we going to call it 80 or 70? What makes more sense if we're going to round it to the tens place? So here I might say, I'll do it 2 ways. I went around to the second decimal place. I did say if the digit after is 5 or bigger, we would bump this up by 1. But what happens if we bump the 9 up by 1? We get 10, and you can't write a 10 in there. So the way that it works there, if that's a 9, is it's like this becomes a 0 and that becomes a 1. 5 and 1 make 6. Okay, that's how the 9s work if they get rounded up. So we get 0.60 to 2 decimal places. You could also just write 0.6. It's not like you have to write the next 0, but if you 2 decimal places there, you see both of them. So I wrote it like that. Now, so that's the procedure if you've got a 9 that you need to bump up. But think about how I first explained this. If we're talking about 2 decimal places, then here are the kind of numbers we're talking about: 0.6 or 0.5. Those numbers have 2 decimal places. And what I'm asking to round this number to 2 decimal places, 0.597, is, well, is it closer to 0.6 or 0.5? Since we're just going to worry about 2 decimal places, then I don't care about the 7. So 0.597. It's way closer to 0.6 than it is to 0.5. All right. So again, that's another way to think that may or may not be helpful, but I think it's definitely worth mentioning this principle of you got a number and you're just trying to cut it off somewhere and decide, is it closer to this or that? Okay, that's what rounding is. Let's talk about rounding to the nearest integer, because some of the questions on MyMathLab do say that. And an integer is a whole number, a positive or negative whole number. So in this one, if I have 1.54, it's like I want to round it to that decimal place right there. What is the principle though? What principle did we talk about? That the next digit over to the right, if it's 5 or bigger, then we round this up. Okay? All right, so this will just be 2. 1.54 rounds up to 2. We don't care about the 5 and the 4. We're rounding it to the nearest whole number. The digits that come after that don't matter. I guess if you could write 2.000 if you wanted to, but it's just 2. Like this one, I could have just written 0.6. I didn't have to write the next 0, but I did. So this one, rounding to the nearest integer, rounds to 2. Okay, so back to my other analogies, like saying, okay, if all we're going to talk about is whole numbers, integers, and we're not going to talk about decimals at all, okay, then we have 2 and we have 1, and then we have 1.54, which is slightly closer to 2. So we're just going to call it 2. But when we look at it, we're going to say, okay, this number 1.54, we're either going to call it a 1 or a 2, but based on this digit, we determine and judge it's a little closer to 2, so we're going to call it 2. All right, that's what rounding is. All right, and then this one, round to the nearest tenth. Okay, so tenth. Remember when in the beginning we talked about the place values? So the first digit to the right of the decimal is the tenths place. So this one could also say round to 1 decimal place. So 5.61. So what was the rule? I want to round to this spot. I look at the digit to the right, and if it's 5 or bigger, I bump this up by 1. In this case, that's a 1. It's not 5 or bigger, so I leave this as 5.6. Just forget about the 1, doesn't matter. All right. To round to the nearest tenth means that any digits that occur to the right, we're going to get rid of and either adjust this one up or down. That's how they all are. Here, if I was going to round to that decimal place, I'm going to adjust that number and throw away all the ones to the right, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's kind of a crash course on rounding. It's something we could talk more about, but based on the questions I got, I thought this might be enough. and we can take the discussion further if needed. Just let me know.